Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this presentation. On behalf of the Hindu Students' Council, I'm pleased to present this event to you. Before we begin, I would like to ask everybody to move forward because many of you are sitting way in the back there. I think you'll have a better experience actually if you sit in the first 6 rows. So if you can move forward, that would be great.
Yeah, if you ask questions in Sanskrit.
So let me begin by introducing our guest speaker. If you didn't hear her speak yesterday, you missed out on a great talk. But I'll give you the introduction again, so for those who weren't here yesterday. We have Anuradha Chaudhary, and I'll just ask her to stand up. A graduate from Sri Aurobindo International Center of Education, who is currently pursuing her PhD in Sanskrit from Pondicherry University on Vedic psychology. She teaches Sanskrit in Oroville, an international township, and is also a freelance teacher with Samskrita Bharati, an organization dedicated to bringing awareness about Sanskrit as a living language for enhancing social harmony. Apart from her passion in Sanskrit, she has been involved in many social activities and won a UN-related scholarship as well. Anuradha is also a research associate with the Indian Psychology Institute in Pondicherry, which seeks to highlight the contributions of India in the field of psychology. So along with her, today we have two panelists. First, Philippe Godin. Philippe Godin completed his PhD in psychology at Rutgers University, clinical psychology internship at the UC San Diego, and is currently a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Psychology at Stanford University. His clinical research focuses on functional neuroimaging investigations of core cognitive affective mechanisms in both healthy adults and in patients with various forms of psychopathology, and the effect of mindfulness, meditation, and cognitive behavioral therapy on neural substrates of emotional reactivity, emotional regulation, and attention regulation, and also the effect of child-parent mindfulness, meditation, training on anxiety, compassion, and quality of family interactions. I think if you want to know more, we should personally speak to Philippe.
Much higher. He's just like
And then we have Emma Safala. Emma is a graduate student in the psychology department at Stanford. She has a long-standing interest in the Vedic and Buddhist traditions to which she's committed through personal practice as well as psychological research. Before attending Stanford, she completed an MA in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism with Robert Tillman at Columbia. Her current research in the psychology department focuses on meditation and compassion. I'd like to briefly explain to you our format for today's presentation before handing it over to the speaker. We have 30 minutes allotted for the speaker, Anuradha, and 30 minutes for questions from our panelists, and 30 minutes for questions from the audience. But we would like you to write down your questions on the pieces of paper that we've provided for you. And if you pass it to Omkar, who I think is at the back there, when it comes time for questions, he will pass on the questions to the panelists and they will interweave their questions with yours so that we can have a more productive discussion. However, you're definitely welcome to stay off after the presentation and ask questions of Anuradha offline. So without further ado, Anuradha. Thank you.
I'd like to start with a small invocation, and it's just a small part of a whole thing, but it should do the job. Om Agnir me vachishritah Vaghridaye Hridayam mai Aham amrite Amritam Brahmani. Okay. Namaste. So, Namaste, seekers of the Veda, seekers of knowledge. Today I propose to take you on a journey that our ancient rishis undertook in the quest of the sun, the truth, the light, the immortality. And I propose that together we turn the pages of those ancient records once more in a new light and maybe walk a path less trodden, and that might make all the difference in understanding those texts. So, the Vedas are regarded as the most ancient texts of the world, and Sri Aurobindo says of the Vedas, says, one might almost say that ancient India was created by the Vedas and by the Veda and Upanishads, and that the visions of inspired seers made a people. The Vedas have played a very important role in being the fountainhead of Indian culture, and they have been seed for the thoughts of the different. Okay, they have been the seed for the different thoughts that have grown in the Indian culture, and they have always been revered as the highest source of knowledge, and that is because they contain a truth, knowing which you know everything. So in the Upanishads you have this about the Vedas. It says, "Yasmin vijyate sarvam idam vijyatam," knowing which everything is known. So, in India and in the world, the Vedas has a threefold status today mainly. So you have one, they're regarded as social historic texts. What's happening?
Oops.
Okay. Sorry. So they're regarded as social historic texts, that is to say, describing ancient tribes or farmers singing songs to gods, performing sacrifice, and in return asking for gifts and all. The second kind of interpretation is that of the ritualistic, why is it doing that? Sorry for the confusion. Why is it doing that? Okay, fine. Yeah, I got it. Okay. So it should not happen again, I guess. Anyway, so the second kind of interpretation is the ritualistic one, where the traditional scholars actually interpret the text as a manual for performing these different rituals and asking favors like heaven, the different heavens, etc. And third, they are also regarded as scientific records. So many scholars today also look upon these texts as the treasure hoard of a lot of scientific knowledge that is hidden in that. Now the question that one asks is that the Vedas have been the source also of the Upanishads and other later philosophies which have been acknowledged for their intellectual genius. So if one looks at the three interpretations that have been given earlier, one wonders how they were regarded with so much respect in the later tradition, in the later intellectual and spiritual traditions. So therefore the question that automatically comes forth is that, is there a deeper meaning at all in the Vedas? And if one acknowledges, if one accepts that there is a deeper sense in the Vedas, the question that one asks is that knowledge of any relevance to us in our modern times? Now, the answer to that is, Sri Aurobindo says, he says that the recovery of the perfect truth of the Veda is not merely a desideratum of a modern intellectual curiosity, but a practical necessity for the future of the human race. It is a very strong statement that he makes, that one has to not just go into it for certain intellectual satisfaction, but actually try and find out, one needs to understand the deeper significance and make it relevant to us in our modern days, modern time. So, one would ask oneself, in what way is the Vedic knowledge relevant to us? How can it become a practical necessity for the future of the human race? So the answer lies in Yaskacharya's commentary. Yaskacharya is one of the earlier commentators on the Vedas. So what he says he says that the Vedas can be interpreted on 3 levels, depending on the level of the interpreter who was trying to understand them. So he said there are 3 gross levels, that is Adhibhautika, Adhidaivata and Adhyatmika. So you have, that's it, Adhibhautika, which is material. Then there is Adhidaivata, which is occult, and Adhyatmika, which is spiritual. Okay. So depending on which level the interpreter was understanding the text from, the Vedas would reveal a different sense to the person. And Sri Aurobindo says that the deeper sense of the Vedas is only understood when one refers to this deeper or adhyatmic interpretation of the text. And he came to this conclusion from his own experience, because when he was doing his sadhana independently, when he was doing his he was in his spiritual quest, he saw that there were certain figures of like Saraswati, Ila, that were recurring constantly when he attained a certain psychological state. Then he concluded, and when he read the Vedas, he found references to these gods and goddesses, for example. So what he concluded is that these gods and goddesses must be symbolic of those states of being that one was in. So he said that the Vedas are primarily symbolic in nature. So based on his own experience, he came to this conclusion that there is a deeper psycho-spiritual sense hidden in these Vedic texts. So what he said, that in order to keep his, in order to be consistent in his psycho-spiritual interpretation, he stuck to 2 principles. One, that the meaning of the words should be consistent throughout the text. I will elaborate on this a little later and you will understand why he made this as one of his fundamental principles. And 2, that it should be philologically justifiable, so that you can't just say that it's a fiction of his imagination. And the result of applying these 2 principles was, 1, that the Vedic hymns revealed an incredible consistency in its sense, that there was a certain coherence in the hymns, not just consistency in the words and all, but the hymns were interlinked in a very meaningful manner. And finally, that the Vedas acquired a universal applicability with that particular sense given to it. Now, when one understood this deeper sense of the Vedas, like symbolic sense, so the sacrifice that the rishis were performing were not just an external sacrifice, but an inner sacrifice that they were doing. I will come to that later on, but what happened as a result of that is that one was aware of the deeper quest of the Vedic rishis. Now this deeper quest is very beautifully depicted in one of the Upanishadic mantras, which says, Om Asato Ma Sad Gamaya, Tamaso Ma Jyotir Gamaya, Mrityor Ma Amritam Gamaya. When this is literally translated, this is the most common translation given to it, is that impel me or take me from falsehood to truth, take me from darkness to light, take me from death to immortality. But what is again interesting is that because of the Sanskrit language, which can have several meanings possible from one particular word, the term asataha can mean from as well as of. So for example, it can mean, when you say asataha ma sad gamaya, asataha can mean take me from falsehood to truth, sad gamaya. Or it can also mean impel me to the truth of the falsehood. Impel me to the light of the darkness. Impel me to the immortality of death. Om, peace, peace, peace. Now if you look at this second sense of the Vedas, or of that particular mantra, you will see that it brings out a completely new dimension to that particular hymn. And this, according to Sri Aurobindo, was the deeper quest of the Vedic rishi. It was like a kind of a quest for the Vedic alchemy. And this Vedic alchemy the object of the Vedic alchemy was to turn base metal into gold, to turn the undivine mortality into its divine immortality, and finally to turn man into God. As I go on, you will understand why I say so. Now, we can re-examine, with this particular background, we can go back to from where the word Veda comes. So the word Veda comes from the root Vid, which can be understood in 3 different ways. That is to know, to be, and to obtain. Again, I say the Sanskrit language is very interesting because you would see, I mean, if one searched deep enough, you would find that there is a certain psychological common denominator between all these three words, all these three aspects. Okay, so in a sense, the Vedas can be understood as the knowledge to be obtained on what to be. Could be one of the senses. The regular meaning that is again given to it is just that it's knowledge. But taking into account the different senses that it has, one could probably derive this meaning from it as well. Another term that one uses for the Vedas is Shruti, that they were heard. They were heard by the rishis at the height of their meditation. And they were revealed to them in the form of mantras. Those who were there yesterday have heard quite a lot about the mantras as being a powerful sound, arrangement of powerful sounds. And the rishis were known as Kavayaha Satya Shrutayaha. So actually if one went into the terminology of the Vedas, one would see that they themselves reveal a lot of their deeper significance. So Kavayaha means poets, Satya Shrutayaha means hearers of the truth. So if one gives it a very typical literal sense, these adjectives that were attributed to these rishis would really be meaningless. Now, to define the mantra, Sri Aurobindo again says, he says, the theory of the mantra is that it is a word of power born out of the secret depths of our being, where it has been brooded upon by a deeper consciousness and then thrown out silently or vocally, precisely for the work of creation. The mantra can not only create new subjective states in ourselves, alter our psychical being, reveal knowledge and faculties that we did not before possess, can not only produce similar results in other minds than that of the user, but can produce vibrations in the mental and vital atmosphere which results in effects, in actions, and even in the production of material forms on the physical plane. This can be understood if one gave a very practical or mundane example. Like, for example, if you make a particular sound, you can shatter glass, and it's that sound alone which would shatter the glass. Now, the mantra also is a certain systematized sound arrangement which would necessarily produce its effects in this world as well in other worlds. Now, going back to how we have the symbolic sense, so I'll give you certain examples and you will see how the symbolism is relevant in its literal sense as well as in its deeper significance. So there are certain key words. Sri Aurobindo says that if you are consistent with key words and the deeper sense of these key words, the hymns will start making more and more sense in the deeper context, in the deeper spiritual context. So certain key words are ritam, ghritam and go. We'll take every word one at a time and see what it means. So the word ritam comes from the root rit. Now when Sayana is trying to interpret these texts, he gives them different meanings, which are possible because Sanskrit is a descriptive language. So it is possible to attribute very literal senses and different meanings to the same word. So in order to fit his ritualistic context, he sometimes calls it, translates it as sacrifice or water or sun or prayer, and once in a while as truth in action. So Sri Aurobindo says that this, to be consistent with the sense of rhythm, you have to take the sense of truth in action as the important factor. Because he says that this truth in action was a very important concept with the rishis. Their ultimate goal was the obtaining of swar. But swar was a state of consciousness, was a state of being, which was qualified by satyam, ritam, brihat. Satyam is the truth, ritam is the right, and brihat is the vast. So they had a lot of emphasis on this concept of ritam or truth. It is only by right thinking, right speaking, right action that you would arrive at that final goal of the swar. And this ritam is also the law of the dynamic divine and the law of this conscious evolution. The other word is ghritam. Now the word ghritam comes from the root ghr, to shine. And the literal sense that is attributed to ghritam is that it is clarified butter, or in Indian we say ghee. And Sri Aurobindo says that the symbolic sense of ghritam is that it's clarified mind, a mind which is full of clear and brilliant thoughts. Now one would wonder what is the common factor between ghritam as clarified butter and as clarity of mind. Now if you go back to the root, as I said, ghr means shining, to shine. So when one applies a certain heat to opaque butter, you acquire a certain liquid, translucent liquid, which is your clarified butter. Now the same process is there when you apply the heat of your aspiration to your mind, which is opaque and ignorant. So when you apply a heat of aspiration to it, it acquires a certain lucid translucency or a certain clarity, which is clarified mind. Now this becomes more understandable in the Vedic context. So we see that in the Vedas, Indra's horses are described as Gritashnu. Or if you understand it literally, it would mean that Indra's horses, Indra is one of the important major deities, those who give it a literal sense, regard him as one of the most important deities of the Veda. So Indra's horses are dripping with clarified butter, which is a very absurd sense. If you understand it from the symbolic perspective, you see that Indra stands for the illumined mind. Horses in several cultures, you will remark, stand for force or power. Even in modern terminology, you talk horsepower, right? So they represent that sense of strength. So when you understand it from this symbolic sense, the same Indra's horses of Gritashnu becomes the powers of the illumined mind are associated with a clarity of mind or with clear and brilliant thoughts. So you have a completely different dimension to that same concept. The last word that we will study in this context is the word go. So this word comes from the root gu, which means cow and can also mean ray. Now when you understand it literally, it means cows. So you would think that the Vedic, rishis are performing sacrifices to get cows. But symbolically they mean ray, light or inner illumination, spiritual illuminations. Again in the Vedic context, we see that when you are performing the sacrifice, the rishis are performing sacrifice to get these animal cows. But again, from the deeper perspective, the rishi was none other than a seer. And when he was performing the sacrifice, it was an inner offering to the greater powers in himself that he was performing this gesture. And he would ask for spiritual illuminations. So that again suits the deeper sense much more than the ritualistic sense. Now one would wonder what was the importance, why did the rishis at all ask for cows? What was the purpose of these cows? So for that one has to understand the 4 fundamental doctrines that the Vedic rishis followed. So they are, 1, that man is an imperfect being and he has to understand himself better and reach that ultimate level, consciousness of swar. 2, that he has to find the different ways leading to that swar. And these different ways are known as ritasya pantha, or the ways of truth, or the ways of the right. So there are several ways, they don't say there's one way. So there's several ways of arriving to that truth. 3, that there is one ultimate truth which has several forms. Ekam sat vipra bahudha vadanti. So there is a very common misconception about Hinduism as being polytheistic. But the Vedas talk of this one supreme being which has several emanations and one can understand it differently. The 4th doctrine that they believed in was they saw life as 3 images. So one is as a battle, a sacrifice and a journey. They said that they recognized through their own sadhana that man is a battlefield of several forces. And there were these forces that were trying to help him realize his self-perfection. So he called them the devas or the beings of light. That's the root of the word. And the other forces were the dasyus or those who were trying to tear him apart and divide him basically. So there was this constant tussle between these forces in man. So that's how he was a battlefield. 2, that there is a sacrifice. Now, I would like to stress a little on this concept of sacrifice because it is one of the key concepts of the Vedas again. The Vedic rishis saw the entire creation in a process of sacrifice. There is a constant exchange of give and take that is happening. But this give and take that is happening is an unconscious process that is taking place. So they asked of man to make this a very conscious gesture. And they said that you offer to the fire in you or the will, the divine will in you, all that you want. And they believe that to what you sacrifice is what will increase in you. So if you want to sacrifice to knowledge, knowledge would increase in you. Literally, you will understand if you dedicate your will and everything to knowledge, you will get more knowledge. So from a very applicable, practical sense, that's what the sacrifice indicated. And there were 3 things which are very important for the sacrifice. So you had, there was Ghritam or clarity of mind that we saw. Soma. Soma represents, literally understood, it represents the wine. Okay, but there is a lot of debate as to what exactly that wine signifies. Shrivinda says that this Soma represents the light, that absolute joy that comes from self-knowledge. And again, you would see the similarity between wine and delight, because both are intoxicating, except that the delight doesn't leave you with a hangover. Okay. Or it leaves you with a permanent hangover. It can be either way. Now, the third thing that was important is the word, or the word of truth. So the Vedas had this very important stress on truth. You say the word, not just mentalize it, but the utterance of the word of truth was very important in the process of sacrifice. The third thing that was, the third image is that of a journey. So they saw man as a hill with different layers of consciousness through which he had to ascend, starting from the lowest, through his own purification, through the sacrifice, through the battle, realize these higher states in himself. Now these three images of the battle, the sacrifice and the journey are best depicted in two legends of the Veda. These legends are not found in one chunk in one place. They are scattered throughout the Vedas, but you can, through references to them, figure out that they are talking of this general image or this general story of the legends. So one legend is the legend of the Angirasa rishis and the lost cows, and two, the legend of Indra liberating the waters from Vritra. Due to shortage of time, I won't go into the second legend and elaborate on the first one. But what this will do is just give you an idea of how the Vedic, what was the thought process of the Vedic rishis, or what was their experience and how they depicted it. So the legend of the Angirasa rishis and the lost cows, very literally understood, talks of the Angirasa rishis. You see them here. Okay. So they are these rishis who are performing the sacrifice and asking for the increase of the possession of cows. So when these cows are increased, gradually there is this other group of bandits or dasyus who interfere and steal these cows and hide them in caves. Now the Angirasa rishis want their cows back, so they perform a sacrifice with the help of Agni or fire. So when they perform the sacrifice, they invoke Indra. Indra is, they call Indra this god, this king of the gods. Indra comes down, he drinks the Soma wine, charges into the caves, and with the help of Sarama is a divine hound, with the help of Sarama enters into the caves, finds these dasyus. Okay, the dasyus are these bandits. Then there is an interesting dialogue that follows, because these dasyus try to win her over. They say, come on, you don't have to go back and report, you stick to our side. But she says, nothing doing, my loyalties are with Indra. She goes back, reports, and Indra comes down. There is a battle between the gods, Indra and all, and these forces, the dasyus. Finally, Indra is victorious, the cows are liberated, and the story goes on to say that the sun is released from the dark caves, which goes into the world of Swar. Now when you see the story very literally, it seems like a typical Indian myth where you have these gods and you have these other demons and they're fighting and the gods are naturally to be victorious. But now, if you understand the deeper symbolic sense of all the words or the terms that are involved, you will see how another picture comes through. So the Angirasa rishis basically again comes from the root Agni, of fire, the aspiration. So they are the power of Agni, man's aspiring soul. They are the speakers of the word of truth, and they perform the sacrifice. Again, that's important. So they have this possession of cows through the sacrifice that they perform. The cows are nothing but the light and spiritual illuminations, and so these cows and all are stolen by the group of dasyus. So the dasyu comes from the root dah, that means to divide. So they are those forces in man which are constantly dividing and tearing him apart. They don't perform the sacrifice. Then you have the vala. Vala is a cover, it comes from the root val, to cover. So they are the coverers in man. They don't allow him to see the entire picture. They are the caves. Then you have the panis. These are very interesting characters. These panis, it again comes from the root pan, to barter. So they are those forces in man which are constantly exchanged in this bargaining process. If I give you this, I'll get this, etc. And we can recognize them in ourselves. And you have finally the vritra, who are the vr from the root again to cover or to tear. You can have both senses. But they again prevent man from seeing the complete picture. So now you apply this to the Vedic story, legend of the Angirasa rishis, and you see how it brings out another sense. because you have these forces in man, these aspiring souls, which through this inner sacrifice are trying to increase the possessions of cows and knowledge. This knowledge is now stolen by these darker forces, or forces which are trying to prevent man from reaching his higher goal. So you have the different, what is again fascinating is the different terminologies that they use for them, which are very specific to the different characteristics of these forces which function in us. So you have these dasyus which are dividing man, panis which are bargaining, and they hide the cows in caves. Now these caves are the darker parts in us which we are unaware of. So the good news in that is that these cows are not lost. They're all there, but we need to fight and you need to get it back. So these Angirasa rishis want their cows back. So the aspiring element in man wants their cows back. How do they get it back? They have to do the sacrifice. They have to light Agni or fire, the will. Once they have kindled the fire in them, they invoke Indra. Indra represents the illumined mind. So with your will, you invoke the illumined mind. The illumined mind comes and drinks the Soma wine, or that delight. Because before going into any battle, if you don't have this fearlessness that comes from delight, you're in trouble. So he drinks this wine, goes into the caves. Now there is this person, the divine hound called Sarama. Sarama is a divine hound and symbolically represents intuition. So she is that aspect in man which can tell you where to go, which knows where the problem lies. But she won't be able to reason. So that's the common thing between a dog and intuition, that both can lead you to your goal without having to reason out how they get there. Okay. So Sarama goes there, then that dialogue happens. So we recognize that dialogue even in ourselves, that you know where things are wrong, and there is this dialoguing, and then you either choose to side with the panis and the other negative forces, or you can choose to come back and report. Now, one interesting function of the dasyus is that everything was in a way contributing to that final goal of man. So the dasyus also are described as, their office is to disturb that which is established in order to push man below, or to give him an opportunity of rising higher by breaking that which was good and harmonious in itself, but imperfect, and in any case to render him dissatisfied with anything short of perfection and drive him continually towards the infinite. So that was their role. Although they look like villains, they are actually very beneficial villains in a sense. Now, yeah. So we have seen this deeper symbolic sense of the Vedas, but these are very fundamental questions that one can ask. That is this story relevant to ordinary man in the modern world? Again, and will it help an individual understand himself better, offer solutions for psychological dilemmas? So I just took a case study, a random situation, and I tried to see how the story could be implemented in daily life and whether it works. So I took the situation of a scholar, and this scholar is very keen on coming up with very original research work. So he's like an Angirasa Rishi who performs his sacrifice, who gives his time, who gives his energy, who has his will, that fire, he's lighting that fire. And naturally, the more time he devotes to his research work, the more knowledge he gets, the more cows he has in his possession. But unfortunately, this scholar has a lot of other distractions. Being in the academic field, we are all quite experienced with this, that you might want to concentrate on one thing, but there's so many other preoccupations which come in the way. So these other preoccupations start acting like the dasyus in him, because they demand his time. Then he has to start calculating whether I give my time here, what. So those are like the panis. So basically they steal his cows, or that time that he could have devoted to get more knowledge is suddenly now distributed and dissipated to, the cows have got stolen. And they are all, it's not that the knowledge is lost, it's just that for the time being, because circumstances are not favorable or because he's not dedicating enough energy into that, he sort of loses that knowledge and it gets pushed into the caves. But the fact is that he is very keen on continuing with his research work. He's very genuine in his aspiration to find something meaningful. So he performs, the Angirasa Rishis are not sleeping, they want to get the cows back. So they perform a sacrifice. He has to renew his will. And how does he renew his will? By the three things that I said. One is the Ghritam, or that clarity of thought. He has to decide very clearly what he wants. So he has to get that involved. Then the word of truth. He has to acknowledge to himself, at least, where the problem lies. Only then can he start working towards resolving his problem. And anyway, when he does these things, the Indra is invoked, or the illumined mind is invoked. So the mind comes into play. Now when the mind comes into play, he drinks the Soma wine, because now he knows where he wants to go. So that confidence of his goal, the destination is there. So that acts like a kind of Soma wine in his system. Then he knows where the problem is. So that's like Sarama, who discovers where the problem lies, goes into the cave. So that's discovering, or being aware of where the problem lies. Then the dialoguing happens, because naturally he is interested in doing these other things, but doing those other things would naturally take away from his ultimate goal. So the dialogue happens, but Sarama, now that's where the decision of the scholar lies. Because if he chooses to go ahead with being distracted, it's like Sarama is siding with the Panis and that group. The outward consequence of that would be that he would go further and further from his goal and get distracted. But if he says nothing doing, I go back and report to Indra, then he goes back to that to his mind. So then the mind starts playing a very important role, where Indra starts deciding, and the outward result of that would be the fact that he pursues his goal. He puts that as his main priority and goes ahead and gets his cows back. Okay, and then there is the thing of the sun, which is liberated. So the sun again represents truth, but truth, one can understand how sun can represent truth, because just as the sun illuminates the outer world, the sun illuminates the inner world. It gives clarity of vision. So once that truth is released, then it brings light into his own being, and he's able to pursue his studies much better. So to conclude, when we look at ourselves, we see that we are not very consistent individuals basically. There are times when you're happy, there are times when you're sad, there are times when you're indifferent, and there's no necessary reason you can attribute it to there's no consistency about it. So the question is that, are we in charge of our lives? So if you are in charge of your lives, are we in charge or are we victims? Is there something else which is looking after us? And if you accept that you are victims of certain forces, then do we have a choice in this whole battle? So then the Vedic rishis, through their deeper meditation, saw this vision of the world as a man being the battlefield of these different forces. So you have the whole Angirasa Rishi story, which is happening in different ways in the lives of different people. And there are these forces which are trying to help man reach his perfection. There are these other forces which are trying to deter him from reaching that, and indirectly pushing him, but deterring him on the main front. And the question that again, in what way does this story become very meaningful, or why is it that the Vedic deeper symbolism becomes relevant? Now, if you just stick to the other interpretations of the Vedas, you see that if you give it a socio-historic sense, then it won't be relevant to many of us because we are not involved in that field at all. If you give it the sense of if you give it the ritualistic sense, then it would, in a sense, lose its importance in the modern world where people are have a real shortage of time. And there are so many rituals and all. Now, if you give it this deeper psycho-spiritual sense, one can see how it becomes very meaningful for each of us in our own lives. The beauty of the Vedic revelations is that these realizations have already been attained by the Vedic rishis in a certain realm. It is a matter of realizing those victories in our life, in our own personal ways, individual lives. So as long as this battle is going on in mankind, the Vedas are bound to continue. And finally, the battle, the sacrifice, and the journey will go on. Thank you. Shubhamastu.
So I would now like to ask the panelists to take their seats and take some questions. Thank you for the great presentation.
Is this on? Yes. So also, just as a reminder, you can ask any questions that you want, and we're happy to weave those in along with us. Also, so several questions.
Great.
If I may have the honor of starting. First of all, thank you very much for presenting. I think it's extremely courageous and kind of you to try to help re-energize knowledge of the Vedas. and to bring a different kind of interpretation. So I'm going to ask, I have several kinds of questions to ask. And, one is, the Vedas help us understand, this is something, it was oral tradition, and it's something that actually, the body of the Vedas actually created over many centuries. Is that correct? So it took time for all the Vedas to actually take form.
Not really.
Yeah?
I mean, like the Vedic thing, I'm not sure actually.
And the reason I asked that is that one of the assumptions, or one of the methods that was proposed by Sri Aurobindo is that to take a given word, where we know that Sanskrit has so many different meanings, a given word, even in different contexts can have different meanings. So if the Vedas really were generated or created over time, then we know historically, even just in the English language, just from 1 to 2 to 3 generations, the same exact word can begin to have many different meanings. So that's why I'm wondering about this initial methodology.
Okay, so what the record of the Vedas is basically this, that it was a knowledge which existed, and there is a person called Veda Vyasa who classified them into these 4 categories of the Rig Veda, the Yajurveda, the Samaveda, and the Atharva Veda. So the Vedas existed because, as I said, they are records of these rishis' experiences. So it was a certain knowledge which was being handed over. Now, India has somehow been very poor in its historic facts, no? Like, we just have these texts to refer to. They don't give you dates, they don't tell you when, who composed what. It isn't exactly composition because it's received, what was received by the rishis. So the Vedas, every Veda is a collection of hymns by different rishis, or it's records of the different rishis which have been classified together by this person called Veda Vyasa, who came at a certain later time, from the time of the Vedas. So that's what we know of the, let's say, origin or the time of the Vedas, or the arrangement. If there's anybody else, I would be very happy, yeah.
Actually, what you just said is actually very good, very high significance, because Sri Aurobindo has actually mentioned exactly the same thing. A language, as the language evolves, and one of his actually his perspective is that the various words like Kritam, go, and those things, the original meaning slowly got concretized. Basically, they got like petrified, as you say. So the original meaning meant it was very fluid in terms of it was expressing the the inner properties of something. Whereas, slowly, for instance, there is a word called brick. Brick means to tear. Okay, and in Sanskrit, brikaha means wolf. Okay, the one that tears. Okay, and he gives that as an example in this book called The Secret of the Veda, where he takes that as an example to explain that this could be the reason why the meanings got some got settled into those we know of today. Okay, so what you said makes sense in that. Yes. So over a period of time, the meanings got petrified.
Okay,
Did I answer?
Yeah, I'm just phrasing questions. Same question, should I follow that up?
So, I have something to say. Actually, I have heard about this word Anadi being used with Vedas, and Anadi means timeless, right?
Anadi. Yeah.
Right, and the belief is that nobody wrote the Vedas; they were just handed down by the gods to the human beings on India or Earth. Yeah, and they were passed down through the Gurukula system of education, and maybe they were lost and then compiled at different times by different sages. But then I don't think there was one single person who wrote, or who was credited with having written the Vedas by himself. Yeah, it's just believed to have been handed down by the gods. I mean, the word Anadi, maybe you can explain better.
Yeah, Anadi means without a beginning. So it's believed that this knowledge was there, and Veda Vyasa classified them into the different Vedas. That's all. And the period of Veda Vyasa is very uncertain.
Okay, so then that raises another question, which is really what you've ended up with, which is and it's something that I mentioned earlier, which is in order to really make this a system of understanding, of knowledge, of truth, of really make it a practice that can be used now. You've already made it very clear too that the socio-historical is one dimension, the ritualistic component is another dimension, but really if we're placing emphasis on the psycho-spiritual, then it becomes more and more necessary for us to try to understand how do you actually implement this. So as I mentioned earlier, there's the text. Well, now we have text, but there's also the oral traditions, because there's still people who chant in the hymns. But to really understand and translate it into practice on a psycho-spiritual level, one thing is, as you've elegantly done, which is to take these myths or stories and show the inner dimension. So like the idea of the sacrifice not being material offering, but literally inner offering of transformation. Does it require having a teacher? Does it require having gone through lots of preparatory practices to be able to understand it? Does it really require us to actually become rishis ourselves in order to understand the intent and the power of the Vedas?
Okay.
It's a big question. But how do you actually implement this?
Yeah.
More than just on the intellectual level.
Yeah. So I think I can understand it in two parts. Like the first part would be about learning the mantras and chanting them correctly, and that aspect of it. So for that, one has to do it with a guru, somebody who has had a tradition of this oral knowledge, because they would know how to produce the sound correctly. The entire efficacy of the mantra lies in the precision of the sound that you produce, how you pronounce every sound. And that has been perfected over time through this oral tradition. For that you have to have a guru. But my understanding of this deeper psycho-spiritual sense is that if any individual looks at himself, you have to just observe. A lot of things has to do with self-observation. You will start noticing these different forces at play. If you know what they are symbolic of, more and more self-observation will reveal to you the functioning of these different forces, these different elements, which later on, if you read the Vedas, you can find a certain correlation, or you will start understanding why the hymns were in that particular order, as they were describing the specific experiences of the rishis. So it was each individual rishi's inner quest. So the journey that he followed has been in a sense charted down in the Veda in his set of hymns. But if one had one's own experience, yeah, because ultimately you can't necessarily take from somebody else wholesale. You have to have your own experience of it. You have to start identifying yourself, the things in yourself. For that, a guru is very useful because he can help you understand yourself better if you get the right person. He can help you understand. So in that sense, he can be an aid. But personally, I believe that one can even do it through one's own intense self-observation. Because these forces are at work. And they're at work in every circumstance, in every situation they are there. So the more you observe yourself, the more you are able to decide. And and then you can start, like personally, because of my studies in the Vedic psychology, I've tried to implement some of this in my case, in the case of my friends. So I've also tried to apply some of it in different situations. So there's somebody who's being unwell, and the person is afraid of the operation that he has to undergo. So you can tell the person, no, you see, you have to light Agni. You have to keep that will. You have to have that assurance in yourself that it will be right. So that's like the soma, the knowledge that it can be right. Because the moment you have fears, they are like these panis and all what will divide you and say, no. The moment you get into that cave, you've had it. You've lost your lights, you've lost your cows. So I believe that one can apply it in one's common life as well. But a guru, of course, is very important because he knows and can show you in a more direct manner where you need to go. So that's how I understand it. Is it?
I don't know. I'm just inquiring. I don't know that.
So, first of all, a wonderful talk. Thank you. So I have a question. Do you think that were the Vedas written in such a way that they were esoteric, so meant only for the specific few who could understand, or like in the Buddhist tradition, it seems like some texts are written, or some schools are more devotional, for example, like just repeating like the Buddha's name or something like that, because perhaps a certain level of society, that's the way, that's like, for example, farmers, etc., like, that's just the way that they're going to be living that spiritual tradition because they don't have maybe a lot of education, etc. And so so what I'm asking is, are the texts such that, if you're, for example, a farmer, then you can interpret it one way, maybe a more devotional way, and that would be an appropriate practice for you. Whereas if you are an erudite scholar or Brahmin or whatever, then you would be understanding it at a much more complex, internally psychological way, the way you're interpreting. Is that?
Yeah. The thing is that I think there's a fundamental difference between the Vedic texts and the Buddhist texts. Because the Vedic texts were not written with an intention. Because there was no mind involved. It was not compositions for a particular class or for something like that. It was just what was revealed to them. They went there, they searched, they had this inner quest, and it was there. That was the knowledge that they received. And that's why they are mantric. This is that you can't play around with the sounds, you can't play around with the words. They are revealed, and the beauty of a mantra is again that if you could calm your mind and actually go back, reproduce those sounds, or with a very silent mind, read the mantras, you can get back that particular experience that the Rishi had. That's the power of a mantra, and that's why the Rig Veda and all the Vedas have their potential of, again, making you re-experience what the Rishi saw. But with the Buddhist texts, the later texts, they are more of a mental nature, let's say. So they were compositions with a particular end in mind, right? And so therefore they composed it. But what you also asked, another important point is that, was this esoteric sense purposely put in there, or was it there? Was it by chance? I mean, was it natural or whatever? So what I understand from this is that any truth is not necessarily digestible by everybody. Because the knowledge that is there, the spiritual knowledge which is available in the Vedas, can actually be very dangerous knowledge because it deals with occult forces. So in order to use that knowledge in a worthy manner, one had to have had a certain kind of self-purification. And only such a person was initiated into that knowledge. So a Brahmin at that time was never one who was born in the Brahmin family. A Brahmin, the word Brahmin comes from the word Brahma, or the word of the word of truth. So it was irrespective of which family you were born into. If you had that inner qualification, the Veda was given to you. And you would not misunderstand it because you know what the Vedas are talking about. But for the later, or those who are not of that inner caliber, if you gave it to them, it was actually what they believed is as dangerous as giving, or it's more dangerous than if you gave a child an atom bomb. Because you don't know how to handle it, it can be disastrous for you, it can be disastrous for everybody around you. So the Vedic knowledge was very potent knowledge actually. And that's why it was revealed only to the initiate. But because of, again, the language, Sanskrit, which can be understood in a literal sense, it's not that these other interpretations are invalid. Because just by performing these rituals, you do get certain experiences. So they are not invalid. But the main question that one asks is whether that is what the Vedas were talking about. Is that the core truth of the Vedas? And that's where the symbolic sense can take one on this deeper spiritual journey. Thank you.
Any follow-up question from the audience about that?
Actually, I
Would like to tell.
I like to do an analogy actually. Like
Okay.
for example, when I was teaching, say for example, mathematics in Illinois, it is not meant for all students. There will be lots of strangers. Say a book is written by Professor Steer. The book of mathematics, algebra for example, is not written to discriminate against anybody. It is there for everybody to take. Everybody can get an A if they understand it. But in my reading, in my general observation, there will be like 10 or 15% of other students, or my students, will get an A, for example. That the book was not written for them, but those 15% students chose to study, they got an A. About half the students, or 25% of the students, got an F. The book itself was not discriminatory. It is up to the people how much effort they put in. Same as Veda. Whoever, regardless of if they come from a rich background or poor background, whoever puts an effort gains the knowledge. few percentage. I taught even here, San Jose State, crime science subject. So same observation. The books are not meant to written for this or that, or to discriminate. As you mentioned, you use the word that was it written so only the Brahmins will understand. No, it's meant for anyone to take. Anyone, even the beings, like those who are the tribal people. If they gain the knowledge with their capability, they become knowledgeable. So
if I may just say, like the word Brahmin, it's a fantastic analogy that you gave, a very practical analogy. But just the word Brahmin, I mean, one can say that it's not only for the Brahmin, because who is the Brahmin is a big question that was asked. So
yeah.
that was, yeah. So you define the Brahmin differently, and it's irrespective of your birth status. Yeah.
I just want to comment or highlight one. We had the great honor of having some written text about the talk, so I had a chance to prepare. But there was one sentence here that you wrote in talking about the second image, which is that of the yajna, or the sacrifice, and I was very taken by that. Because there can be many different responses psychologically to the idea of sacrifice. In one way, what am I giving up? What am I losing? Ugh, which is kind of a self-centered point of view. And what you highlight in the text and also in the talk and coming from the Vedas itself, sacrifice is an act of creation. Each time it is performed, it recreates the performer, the agent, as well as the cosmos. So I think that's absolutely beautiful. And I think it's also very profound. It also can be, as you pointed out, very scary, because this is a very potent way of saying each of us is highly responsible for the actions that we take and the sacrifice that we engage in. So when you talk about truth of action, or acting the right, I'm thinking immediately of certain forms of psychotherapy that are currently practiced that are very much influenced by Eastern ideas like acceptance and commitment therapy, where they talk about act according to your values. So here you say that one really accrues based on what you're willing to sacrifice. And obviously lower down you talk about self-immolation, actually offering yourself, so much so that you no longer have that concrete, stuck, small self. And so that's what, one way I see this is kind of like the crux of the practice. But to get to the level of being able to see sacrifice as freedom, as opposed to material loss, or loss of my sense of self, which can either be a source of freedom or can be, for most people, it's a source of fear, at least here in the West. So this is.
But doesn't, I mean, if I may just, this fear that you're talking is typically a funny action. It's typically them who don't want to perform a sacrifice, and their ultimate goal is only their growth, or because interestingly enough, in the Vedas they describe these panis as Gomati or Ashwamati, as if they have the cows, they have the knowledge, I mean they have the force, but they don't perform the sacrifice. And if you don't give, if you don't perform it, you will not get. You're all the time busy saving, busy getting for yourself. So it's interesting, the difference what you said, no?
Yeah, I mean, from a Western, I'm thinking because I also lived in India for 6-7 years, so I have some little taste of what that feels like to not be in the Western road. I'm from New York City, a very self-centered part of the world, but a beautiful part. Whereas, this notion of what it really means to sacrifice and to offer, and having a teacher, guru, as an example of somebody who can demonstrate, manifest that, like a living rishi, because here it's very hard to really conceive of what it means to let go of certain things that we think are fundamental to my sense of self. In psychotherapy, where people are stuck according to the dashrus and the ranis and the people who are trafficking and obscure, trying to help people let go of little pieces of the self is usually the goal, not the ultimate sacrifice that the Vedas are really talking about. So that's why I really think about many, many steps and having to have somebody who can guide and say, oh, you're going this way, that's not right, or this way, that's not right. That's why I'm still not sure that really just reading the text or doing the mantras alone would be sufficient, because you really see, that's a different tradition. I mean,
it won't be sufficient. Definitely won't be the only thing. Like you can't be chanting the mantras and do something completely different in your life. But this is again from somebody's experience, who said that if you do the chanting of the mantras very sincerely, it will prevent you from doing things which go against the spirit of the Vedas. Because it creates that kind of an atmosphere in oneself. So if one did it with that devotion and that spirit, it would automatically stop a lot of other things. But the devotion and the sincerity is what counts. Not doing the mantras as they necessarily do them in temples just as a profession. That's not what is implied.
So can you go to DC tomorrow and help George Bush? Do a little bit of self-purification so he can stop destroying the world.
If he wants to be helped.
That would be great.
There's a question from the audience, and are internal forces driven by external forces? And actually, in social psychology, it's a whole field devoted to showing how different environments will make people act differently. Just and that you're really very much influenced by that. And so, I guess perhaps you could answer this question with regard to whether the text in any way address those external forces as well as the internal.
Okay, so what I understand on this, the relation between the individual and society is this, that the ultimate goal of each individual is to realize his self-perfection. So he has to do that journey. Now in that journey there would be helpers as well as deterrent factors. So even society can act like these Dasyus and Pandis or like the Indras. So in our society there are certain forces which help you, which encourage you to become a better individual. So they are like that at that moment. But you can't blame them because you are making the choice. The ultimate sarama, which side of the battle you fight, is entirely in your hands. Entirely. So there's no two way about that in the Veda.
I'm with you.
What a contrast to other forms of religious practice where the final resolution is not in your hands. Where there is somebody else who decides.
The ultimate final resolution is not in your hands, probably. There are several levels of... That's a tricky one.
So, actually, I asked that question, and the original intention was a little bit different. When we talk about all these texts, we talk about internal forces, right? So that means they are part of us. We just need to recognize them. That's a fact. When you talk about social forces could be different. When I talked about external forces, I was more intended towards natural forces, that we tend to behave in a certain way because we are either synchronized with the nature or we are not, right? So the way we behave, correct me, that it is also dependent on nature, and I expect that those are also forces which changes our behavior. So there is internal, which is the way we are wired. And there are external, which the wiring gets changed depending on natural forces.
What I would understand from this is that if you observe that even in a natural environment that you're saying, there are different individuals who behave differently in the same environment. So what is causing these differences? So that is each individual's reactions to those natural situations. So it's finally a lot depends on the individual and his reaction, how he lets things influence him and grow from that, or either get carried away, or whichever. So I think ultimately it all lies in the hands of the individual.
But to what extent these reactions or responses to external forces, to what extent they are made through choice or volition, as opposed to just impulsive reaction.
The thing is, the whole of the Vedic journey is a demand from the individual to become conscious, more and more conscious. So the more and more conscious he becomes, the less he will be a victim of circumstance. So irrespective of where he is, if he is a conscious human being, he can benefit from even the most adverse circumstances. And that is these decisions that he's making when he recognizes these different forces that act directly in his own system or which take the faces of different forms around him. It can be natural, it can be, you name it, and it can be anything. If you watch the film Matrix, there is this interesting Smith who can become anything. But his goal is to stop this person reaching his goal, no? Neo. So one could understand it in that sense also, probably.
Could you write down, and because you have a whole pile of them. Omkar, please take a question.
It's too bad we have to break the spontaneity because I'm sure people are reacting.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll let her.
Okay, no, we have time, so it's okay.
Okay.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
So how does, I think it's related to this, how does karma play into this? Like you said that even if you're fully conscious, you might not be able to achieve what you want to, right? So could karma be playing into it?
Okay. What do you understand as karma?
Like past deeds, both good and bad? Isn't Vedas all about your karma?
No. In a sense, yes, because it depends which way you choose. That will determine what you get. So if that student, for example, in that particular example, if that student, kept getting distracted, and
so why is he getting distracted? Is he like destined to get distracted, or is it because of...
But that's what that journey is all about, right? To become more conscious.
Yeah, to become more conscious. I guess the more one becomes conscious, the more one can free oneself from apparent impositions of your past life or circumstances. Until then, it's true that there is a certain, that's how I understand it, that there is a certain flow that has started because of your deeds. And you have to sort of face that somewhere.
Yeah, there's some momentum in place.
There is a momentum in place, but it's not ultimate. You can break that momentum with how fast you choose to come out of it. That is an important point.
How would you define the term conscious in this context that we are talking about? It is not simply being conscious means being awake and knowing about, aware of oneself.
Yeah, it's your inner awareness.
Yeah.
The whys and the wheres and the whats of your life, probably. Why do you do what you do? Why do you choose what you choose?
Yeah, so just to reflect a little bit, because one of the things that's happening here in the Western, and actually everywhere, is that there's a growing, and this is just to really reflect back on this notion that at least from how you've represented the Vedas and the tradition, it's really about how far can I extend the expansiveness, the extensiveness, some of the words that you used in the text, of the mind, to really be like the sun, illuminated, and to achieve a state of sattva, or to achieve this unobstructed state. What's interesting now in the West, in terms of psychology, which is becoming much more biological, for better or for worse. Human beings are becoming more mechanical. I can put a heart machine, I can replace parts of your brain tissue. We're becoming much more genetically focused. Not that that necessarily explains more than other nature, other environmental factors. But we're reaching more and more for reductionistic explanations. And so at least what you presented today is, at least from the psychological perspective, is that the mind, the ability to use one's mind, and the innate illumined qualities, the cows, I like that, of the mind, actually are already there, that they need to be unearthed, so to speak. So it's just an interesting tension, because at least now in the West, most of psychology is becoming grounded in biology, and where we're reducing the explanatory power of will, conscious will, that's free from priming or influence. So when you mentioned consciousness, conscious awareness, and we know that from brain, because that's one of the things that I study, most of how we process every moment of wake and sleep is most of it is actually not conscious processing. It's neural processing that's happening on a time scale. It's much faster. Having said that, there are certain rishis, yogis, meditators currently living who do claim through their practice to be able to refine their attention so that they can become aware of moment to moment to moment to moment unfolding, occurring, unfolding, creating, sacrificing, creating, unfolding, living, dying. So there are people who claim that there are much further and more extensive capacities of mind. But it is interesting to see that it's in the face of our yearning to concretize in biology genetics, which even now the evidence that we have is not more explanatory than what we had 20, 30 years ago. But you can put in a fake arm, a fake leg, a butt, anything you want actually. So it's interesting. It's important that what's represented about the ability of the mind in the Vedas is something you're holding the torch.
Yeah, but in a
We
sense,
already have a fake heart.
Yeah, we do.
no, but in a sense, I had to stop with this particular story where Indra is depicted as the highest faculty, but the Veda doesn't stop with that. Excuse me. Yeah. Okay. Suspense. That's what it can happen. Excuse me.
So that is where you get your higher consciousness.
Yeah, the moments of silence. Okay, so the Vedic vision of the world itself starts explaining to you a lot more of where they were attempting, where it was all going. So the Vedas actually see the world, the sevenfold division of the world. Okay, before that I'll have to tell you what is the Vedic concept of creation in a sense. How did this whole creation come about? So one of the Upanishads tells you that, the Taittiriya Upanishad, it says that this superconscious existed, the all being, everything existed. And then suddenly for no reason it felt lonely. So it decided to create another. Now how would it create another? Anybody?
By dividing oneself.
No, it is. So dividing oneself
Desire.
is Huh?
Desire?
Desire, okay. Okay, so what he did basically is that he created an exact opposite of himself. Because the only way another could exist is when it didn't exist, in a sense. So he created this absolute negative. So if he was light, that was darkness. But the problem is that this absolute opposite didn't have any reality of existence. Because this is, that is not. And therefore that became weak, or Shitilam about it. It started losing its importance. And it started losing its whatever it was. So then, in order to give that certain validity, this plunged into that. Okay, so now the whole purpose of creation in a way is to rediscover itself through that. So what the Vedas do is that they divide existence into 7 levels of consciousness. So through this talk I've really touched the fringes of what the Vedas go into. But to give you an idea, I had spoken about that. Now, the Vedas divide the world into these 7 layers, which if you go from top down, is Sat, Chit, Ananda, or truth, consciousness, bliss. Then you have a middle world, which is called Vijnana or Mahas, or also you can term it as supramental, or Shervino terms that realm supramental. Then you have mind, life, body. Okay, so when the absolute negation of that all-knowing, all-thing was matter which didn't know anything. But if you look at creation, from matter life came. So how was it possible for life to emerge out of matter if life was not involved in matter somewhere? So the whole purpose of man is from this ignorant hill of being. The hill of being represents his ignorance, the concretization of the ignorance of creation. And that has these different levels of being. So we can go into the legend of Vritra, where it says that because ultimately that superconscious has become all of this. So there is that delight, that truth, that sun which was everything, is there even in the darkest caves, is there even in this body, is there even in matter. And one has to rediscover that sun in the darkness. So the Vedas talks about going from one level to another, to another, to another. And they say that this lower level of life, mind, life and body is based on ignorance. Because the highest faculty in this is the mind, which is not an instrument of knowledge. It doesn't know, it will reason. And reason is only an approximate guess of the truth. The upper 4 worlds are the worlds of consciousness or knowledge. They are knowledge based. So you have Sat, Chit, Ananda, truth, consciousness, bliss. So the goal of the rishis was basically to climb the hill of being of this negative thing and reach that superconscious experience. And once they had reached that experience, they say that there is a particular experience that the rishi describes as acquiring. Okay, in this, I'll go into it. Because it says in this story, legend of the Vedic rishi, in this Angirasa Rishi legend, there is this concept of, there are two kinds of Angirasa Rishis basically, or there is one kind of Angirasa which becomes the second kind of Angirasa Rishi. So you have these Angirasa Rishis who are known as Navagwas, or they perform the sacrifice over 9 months. Now again there are some very occult truths about what these 9 months are. I have yet to find out. Okay, so what this month signifies is a question, because then there is the dawn, after every sacrifice, after every night that one experiences. So now when I tell you the terms like night, it would mean the ignorance of the time when they are lost, those cows are. So this night every time is followed by a dawn, or those rishis who find the cows again are greeted by Usha, or the dawn. And then because it's not a permanent realization, again there is the night which will follow. So similarly in this way there are 9 months of sacrifice that they perform continuously. Now these rishis are unable to, although they get the cows, they are unable to release that sun which is in the dark caves, because they don't have the power. So they say that there is a rishi called Ayasya. So when Ayasya joins these, he is the 10th rishi who joins this fold of 9. When he contributes to this, then they get the sun. And what is his contribution? He is the knower of the 7-headed thought. So now the knower of the 7-headed thought means that he knows the truth, the absolute truth of every level of consciousness. So when he has that knowledge, when you are equipped with that knowledge, only then you can go into the cave and release the sun. Until then, this game of losing the cows, winning the cows will be happening. So, yeah, because the Vedic Rishi describes his experience, he says, when Ayasya joins this company of Navagwas, then the Vritras and all can harm him no more. Because then they know the truth of all principles, they have gone beyond that. And interestingly enough, they say that this 7-headed thought has to be established in the 7 waters. So the 7 waters represents the movement of the 7 levels of consciousness. So when that knowledge of these levels is inside the movement, the knowledge of the movement of these levels, then you get the release of the honey. So this honey that the Vedas talks about is the sweetness of existence, or the sweetness of creation, which flows behind. It's not that it doesn't exist, it flows behind. But it's only when the rishi, through this particular effort, through the sacrifice is very important, performs sacrifice and gets these cows, gets these waters flowing, that he can taste of that honey. So it's not that you have all of this in one part, necessarily. The rishis, as and when they experience the different things, describe them in their experiences throughout the Vedas. So they're scattered here and there. So in a sense, we are all rishis in our own respect, let's say, who have to create our own legends and discover once more those things that were there behind. Discover the honey, taste of the honey that existed.
I just need to reflect on something for a moment, because the way you just described this was so beautiful and elegant. And what I'm realizing is that most of us, throughout our days, are filled with all kinds of negative thoughts and worries, and the computer breaking down, and the mouse not working, and getting frustrated, or getting too much mail, or not enough mail, or the wrong letter, the wrong email. And one thing I'm realizing is, just listening to you speak, one of the things that's so beautiful about literature, ideas, mythology, in this case manifested by the truth of the Vedas, is that this gives us an imagery that, just hearing this, like you were speaking English, not Sanskrit, but just the way you were speaking and manifesting the honey and dripping, we have images that can actually bring a certain sense of peace. And it's something to anchor our yearnings and our beliefs. A story, an image of, even the 7 waters rippling. So that's one of the most beautiful things that you can offer from this tradition, is a way of seeing the world in a way that I'm currently not when I'm in front of my computer screen for 10 hours a day. And that in and of itself is very beneficial in loosening the grip of the concreteness, of the rigidity of the mind.
Exactly.
And so that in and of itself is one, the use of visual metaphor like that, or even language, just listening to you speak, is a method.
Yeah. It was interesting because I was discussing with a person who's practicing clinical psychology in Canada. So, because I'm in this field and I'm not aware of psychotherapy as such, or the Western psychology. So I was just sharing ideas with her, and what she told me is that how they help people solve their problems. They say that we make them distance themselves from their problems. So you recognize that, okay, this element is there in me and it wants such and such thing. This element is also there in me and it wants such and such thing. Now, there is a conflict between these two, that's why I suffer, basically. And I'm putting it in a very simplistic manner. So they suffer, and therefore what one can do is to have them dialogue between each other and see where you can come to a common ground where the suffering is at its minimum or it gives you a positive result. So if you look at it from the Vedic perspective, I believe that the moment you see them as forces or as Indra or as the Dasyus or Panis, you are attributing a certain personality to them. And it becomes much easier to deal with them. So instead of an abstract notion, as you very rightly pointed out, the imagery or the meaning that you give to them makes it much easier for you to deal or to choose sides. But what the Vedas would, in a sense, go a step further than just this practice of trying to make them dialogue and come to a conclusion, I believe, is that these forces are not randomly trying to either want or not want. There is a definite goal that, according to the Vedic Rishi, you are headed towards. So therefore, there are reasons for you to take one side and reasons for you not to take the other side. So if there is one side which is trying to help you towards this greater goal, there are many. I mean, it's obvious that that's where you should be putting your everything on. So there is this vision of a goal that you are headed towards, and therefore it makes dealing with forces more easier. I guess easier, in whichever way easier can be understood.
Would that goal be called choosing the Shreyas? Shreyas is the word?
Yes, Shreyas, the good, the right, in that sense of
the
right.
direction.
So we have a question from the audience, which I think is nice. What inspired you to take up this research, personally? Are you thinking of continuing this research to different kinds of people?
Who's asked the question? Can be more specific? Yes, please.
What inspired you to take up this, to study the Vedas or to come up with the idea that to separate it from Indras and the Pani and do a research on a scholarly person that you did the research, right, on this scholarly person who was
that was just an application.
So that was a research or what? This was application of the Vedas, right, that you did?
Yeah, basically like I have based my whole study on Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Vedas. So I went into the Vedas primarily because of that particular line which says Yasmin Vidyate Sarvam Idam Vidyatam, knowing which you know everything. So I said, wow, there's such a shortcut in life, then why do I do it? No, seriously. So that's the reason why I said let's look at the Vedas a little closer. And then I read Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, which seemed to make more sense than anything else. And it said it had practical application to me. So even during my research, I was thinking of concentrating on one thing and then another. But this suddenly, I was asked to present at a psychology conference. And that's the first time that they required it to be brought down at a very day-to-day circumstance. So then I was just trying to figure out, and then that's how it came to me. And I mean, you can apply it, and that became more meaningful and continue it definitely, because if those 10,070 verses are records of psychology, then a lot of work to do.
I have a question on the application. So part of it you talk about making that determination or making that sankalpa to go in making the right choice. How does it reconcile with the concept of surrender or thy will be done? Does Vedas kind of reconcile that? Any thoughts on that?
The whole concept of sacrifice is surrender, basically. Because the idea is what you're sacrificing to is what grows in you. So you sacrifice to these gods in you. You direct all your thing to these higher powers which are trying to help you. They can be in the form of a guru, they can be in the form of a god, they can be in any form.
So you kind of become transparent to that transcendental.
Exactly. It's like you're sacrificing, you becoming more and more open to these other gods in you. And each of these gods, for example, are symbolic of different states of being, as I said. So Indra was a mind, you have Varuna, who represents this vastness, absolute vastness. So after a stage, and there is a certain order in which these gods are invoked, interestingly enough. Agni is Purohita. The first mantra starts Agni Nile Purohitam. Why is he Purohitam? Because he's Purohitam because you place him in front. Purahitam. So if you don't place your will in front, you are absolutely incapacitated. You can't do anything. So you have to invoke Agni. And Agni is the only fire, only God who burns in the night. He's the only God who works in the night. And that is because in that darkness that was created, that divine will plunged. And Agni is somewhere symbolic of that. And that is growing. And you have to, and that is growing through matter. Veda says that grows through matter in the form of the trees, the aspiration towards the heights, no? Vanani, it says. And you're asking for wealth. What is this wealth that you're asking for? So they're the same words but given a completely different understanding.
So I can't help but riff on this idea of riff meaning as a jazz musician, reflecting on this whole notion of Agni, because I don't know how many people here have actually witnessed fire puja. Okay, there we go. So generally, are they done at night only and not during the day? Or can it be done any time of the day?
What do you mean by Agni Puja?
Actually, a fire puja, which is part of the, literally, fire puja.
It can be done anytime.
Okay, so what's really interesting is that even though this is coming, there must be something really pervasive in this, because I'm thinking of even in Tibetan tantric Buddhist rituals, they also retain the fire puja.
Yeah, if I may, I mean, you'll be surprised as to how much of the similar imagery you'll find across several ancient cultures. In Egypt, in Mesopotamia, there are symbols that you can recognize the whole story of Indra releasing the waters.
Yes.
Because as I talked of the waters in the 7 worlds, the 7 rivers, Indra representing the mind, this I have seen, that there is a picture of this hill and there is this figure which is crouching out of it, and there are waters that are flowing and there is something which is breaking it. So I mean, familiarity with this concept, this idea of the Vedas, you can recognize the pattern. And there are many big questions that
Joseph Campbell's
Yeah, I just mentioned Joseph Campbell's work as a way of looking at these very core schemas, these core patterns across all the different traditions that have slightly different flavors, but they all come from the similar source.
So it's possible that the earlier traditions were much more aware of what this creation is all about, and they were quite clear about the fundamentals.
Even in Zoroastrian culture, Agni,
absolutely. In fact, the mantras of that, or whatever the chants of that, are very close to the Vedic mantras.
Now, you mentioned about the 7 levels of consciousness in 7 words to climb to. Is at the micro level, is that the analogy of the 7 chakras inside us, and the Kundalini rising through the 7 chakras?
It could be understood in that way also, because I believe whatever is there in that highest truth has its reflections at every level. The Vedas not only talks of 7 worlds, it talks of 21 worlds, 22 worlds. What are these 22? That each world has when you talk of 21 worlds, it means that every world plus the world above plus the world below. So beautifully enough, you have these 7 worlds. So for the Sat, the highest world, there is a world below, and the next world, the higher world, is the lowest. So it's a cyclic thing. So you have 21 plus 22 is the ensemble of the whole thing. Then you have 49 or 50 worlds. So what does that mean? All the 7 worlds present in every world. An ensemble of that. Then 100, 1000. So what were they referring to when they talked of 1000 gates? Probably the sacrifice, the more you perform the sacrifice, and as you move spiritually in other realms, you have to repeat these experiences and purify. I don't know. I can just assume.
There was does somebody have a question? There's a question on sacrifice. So and I think it sounds like we're all interested in this inner sacrifice, very beautiful notion. The question is there a difference between self-imposed sacrifice and one that is imposed on you? Well, maybe we touched on this earlier with your question, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this inner sacrifice.
What do you mean by imposed on you?
Is it
whoever asks?
Yeah.
Who imposed it on you?
Was it from the external?
No, what do you mean by a sacrifice which is imposed on you if yeah.
Well, I mean, for instance, someone who has to work in a factory for 12 hours a day to meet conditions to live is sort of something that's imposed upon you by your environment, whereas a sacrifice that you make sort of out of charity or something, to benefit yourself, that you do for yourself, it's two different, I'm wondering.
Yeah. So I think one needs to understand the word sacrifice better.
Okay.
In the sense that it's not giving up your time or that, as was mentioned necessarily. The sacrifice was one's inner movement. So the individual is what counts. The circumstance are something else. So you can be working or you can be in any kind of a circumstance. But what mattered was how you were reacting to it. What was your take on it, let's say in a sense. So it's not that the 12 hours are not, it's not the outer circumstances that ever mattered for the Rishi. It was always what he was. How was he reacting or how was he utilizing circumstance for his own growth. So you can be working 12 hours and 12 hours if you're only thinking of the truth, you're thinking of enjoying what you're doing, you're thinking of being, that is what was the sacrifice. You offer it up to the gods, you want to grow in your